So now it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Catharine MacKinnon. Just a minute. Catharine A. MacKinnon is a lawyer, teacher, writer, scholar, and activist for equality. Her theoretical and practical work as a public intellectual and a practicing lawyer, domestically and internationally, centers on recognizing that sex crimes are crimes of inequality. She is the Elizabeth A. Long Professor of Law Emerita at the University of Michigan and the James Barr Ames Visiting Professor of Law, Harvard Law School since 2009. Among her other work, Professor MacKinnon pioneered the legal claim for sexual harassment as a form of sex discrimination. With Andrea Dworkin, she created the equality approach to pornography and racist hate speech, which were largely accepted by the Supreme Court of Canada. With Bosnian and Croatian survivors of Serbian-led genocide, she conceived rape as an act of genocide, and with co-counsel, established it in law and secured a damage award at trial for survivors. She drafted language that became part of the Palmero Protocol on International Trafficking and anti-trafficking legislation that was passed by Congress in the United States. She and Andrea Dworkin conceived and she proposed in 1990 the Nordic equality model for abolishing prostitution, decriminalizing prostitute people, offering exit support, and penalizing their buyers and sellers. Passed in Sweden in 1999, this approach has since become law in Norway, Iceland, Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, Canada, France, and Israel, as well as the state of Maine in the United States, and is currently being considered in 12 other US states. From 2008 to 2012, Professor MacKinnon was a special gender advisor to the first prosecutor of the ICC, where she implemented her concept gender crime under the Rome Statute. For decades, she taught the legal theory that discrimination against gay men, lesbian women, and trans people is sex discrimination, accepted by the US Supreme Court in 2020. Her work has received many awards and recognitions, including an honorary doctorate from Hebrew University. In 2022, she was elected for the Henry Phillips Prize in Jurisprudence by the American Philosophy Society, awarded only 27 times since 1895. She has written many articles and over a dozen books, translated into many languages, of which she is competent in German, Spanish, and French, including a special collection in Hebrew, published in Wrestling in 2005, Legal Feminism in Theory and in Practice, with an introduction by Daphna Barak-Erez. She has taught law and politics, litigated, worked with survivors, spoken publicly, and made legal change in the United States and around the world for 50 years, and continues to engage in these activities. According to the empirical studies, she has often been the most frequent cited women scholar writing on law in English and among the top most cited legal scholars over time. Professor MacKinnon, we are truly honored to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
I am so moved to be in Israel, especially at this time, but also always. It's the only place I miss when I haven't been here other than home. Also, I mean, all the pain, the struggles, the history, everything speaks to my heart in a very particular way. Also, you are the best audiences I ever speak to anywhere. The most responsive, the most vibrant, the most well-informed, with really interesting, direct, challenging, actually, honestly, brilliant questions. And I'm also truly honored that so many of you do read my work. and that you bring back to me what it has meant to you. It means the whole world to me that you do this, and it's distinctive here. So thank you to Tal Hochmanan especially for organizing today, and for the inspiration that created the possibility of us being together today, and to all the programs who have sponsored us and joined in it. I'm also especially grateful to Tatiana Kotlyarenko, who is an expert on this subject that we're talking about today in her own right, and I want to acknowledge the tremendous privilege it is to work with her. So thank you, Tatiana. So I am here to situate the current Israeli law, its realities as the law itself, and its realities as they have developed since its passage in 2018, in a larger framework of the global context of prostitution law and politics, empirically and theoretically, and through tracing some of the developments and trends in the political, social, and psychological debate and laws on this topic. I will also be offering a new legal theory that intervenes in this debate under international law with evidence, some of it recently published. I've never spoken about it before anywhere. Some of it not yet published, which I've also never spoken about before, that is relevant to the many current national engagements around the world, including in Israel. And the panelists after me will contribute fully to this discussion, and you, the audience, will also be given the opportunity to contribute to that discussion. So at the backdrop of of the discussion of prostitution and in its law is the conventional prohibitionist model in which all actors are illegal, that is the buyers, the sellers, and the bought and sold, okay? Those are the main actors. This is the status quo in most places. It's quite obvious to those of us who have worked in this field, some of us for 50 years like me, which is, how you get all this white hair. It's obvious that it doesn't work, really not for anyone, that prostitution flourishes under this criminal prohibition of everyone in it, and also that the people who are most harmed by the sex industry are the ones generally most targeted by law enforcement, and therefore continue to be harmed by the state. In other words, it's completely backwards. Israel, however, is already beyond this, as you've seen in the introduction, so it is irrelevant, and I'm not going to talk about it anymore. Now, the current debate, including here, within and across nations, revolves, and it was referred to by Daphne Hacker in her comment, revolves around two fundamental positions. And this polarizes them somewhat, but this is a remarkably polarized debate, although there are some subtleties in some people's positions within it. But I'm going to make them a little oversimple for this purpose. These are the sex work model and the sexual exploitation approach, those two. When prostitution is termed sex work, it is usually understood as being the oldest profession, as people call it, a cultural universal, although, by the way, I've researched this and I can't find anyone who researches cultural universals who lists prostitution on their lists, which is interesting, although people who don't research it refer to it as a cultural universal. It's considered consensual because it is paid in this sex work approach. It's considered stigmatized because it is illegal and regarded as a job like any other that is denied that recognition. And some people consider it also a form of sexual liberation. It is widely romanticized, including in Oscar-winning entertainment. These sex workers are seen to be expressing what is its academic advocates term their agency. Of the many meanings of this particular term that no one seems to think they have to define, and I will note that there are whole libraries on terms like freedom, right? Of which this is apparently some part or some sort of handy part. But no libraries are off defining what people mean by agency. So it's free floating out there in the world. But it seems to mean in this context, freely choosing, this is called how you are and get in prostitution, actively empowering, deciding among life chances, asserting oneself in a feisty fashion, fighting back against forces of femininity, there's a lot of F's in this piece, resisting moralistic stereotypes. That is what these agentic actors, these sex workers, most of them women and girls, are seen to be engaging in when they express their agency. In particular, control the sexual interactions, be compensated for what is usually expected from women for free, and having independent lives and anonymous sex with many partners. All of those last behaviors, activities, are usually monopolized by men in society, hence apparently liberating for women. Some women in the sex work view graduate to the higher masculine role of selling other women to men for sex and are termed managers or entrepreneurs. This view is often defended by those who have not been and never will be a part of the sex industry. They have better jobs. In contrast, the sexual exploitation approach sees prostitution as perhaps the oldest oppression. And here there's a lot of interesting historical information that hasn't been mined, and anybody who wants to go after it, I'm inviting you to do that, which says or suggests or implies that prostitution may be derived from the sexual slavery of captives in war, a highly relevant topic at present. This is not conclusive, but a lot of historians of sexual slavery say, quote, women were the first slaves. And this is what they're referring to. So I encourage historians to look further in more depth into this. The sexual exploitation approach also considers prostitution to be as widespread as the sex and gender inequality of which it is analyzed as a cornerstone. Prostitute, last time you'll hear me use the term, the noun, is here seen as misleadingly and denigratingly equating who people are with what is being done to them. Therefore, it is not used in the sexual exploitation approach. The participle form, that is prostituted people, by contrast, is used as it highlights the people and the social forces who are acting upon people to define the situation that they are in. The term sex work is rejected in the sexual exploitation approach following learning from survivors as embodying a false characterization of the reality of the exploitation. Here, prostitution isn't sex in the sense of intimacy and mutuality of desire, and it is not work in the sense of productivity and dignity. Based on information from the women themselves, women in prostitution, including trans women, are prostituted through choices precluded, through options restricted, through possibilities shut down and denied. Although we don't pretend to know the full scope and prevalence of prostitution's arrangements, with all of its forms and varieties of transactional sex, and it isn't all definitively documented, what is known reflects considerable information on the sex industry from exited survivors. The term is used, that is, to be a survivor, you have to be out of at least the immediate situation. In other words, if you're still in a concentration camp, you haven't survived the concentration camp, right? So exited is a term, I don't mean to say that it's a simple leaving and then you're done, by no means. But all I'm saying is if you are still in prostitution, a survivor is not quite what you yet are. And also, this analysis does not reflect a pre-existing assumption or attribution of victim status. Prostitution is instead observed to be a product of lack of choice, the resort of people with the fewest choices, or none at all when everything fails, which for women especially, whose survival is often vicarious, that is, through discrimination, women often survive only through support of other people, is what I'm saying here, often men. And for women, all else fails often. The coercion behind the industry, physical and otherwise, which is actually that coercion is recognized by the buyers of very careful studies of them. Produces an economic sector of sexual abuse, with the lion's share of the profits going to other people. And all of this is equally true of pornography, an arm of prostitution, and of OnlyFans, the latest hybrid of pornography and prostitution of the sex industry, as to which evidence is increasingly coming out, consistent with what I've just been saying. So in these transactions, in the sexual exploitation view, the money coerces the sex. It does not provide consent to it. This makes prostitution, as survivors teach, a practice of serial rape, industrial rape, which can involve 6, 10, up to 20 men a day, depending where you are and what the arrangements and forms of force and counting are. In this analysis, there can be nothing equal about it. Prostituted people are the people who pay for paid sex. The buyers don't pay for what they take or what they get. It is this, and I think the lack of human dignity involved in it, that is the intimacy of the degradation and violation. Okay, look, no other occupation has the vagina as its workplace. There is no other job that presumes the buyer gets to go inside your body. Okay? And it's that, and not its illegality, that accounts for prostitution's stigma, I think. People in prostitution in this view are wrongly saddled with a stigma that properly belongs to their exploiters, their buyers, and their sellers. So each analysis has a corresponding legal approach. The sex work approach favors across-the-board decriminalization or various forms of legalization, usually with some state regulation, sometimes beginning with unionization, moving toward decriminalization across the board. The goal here is to remove criminal sanctions from all actors in the sex industry so that prostitution becomes seen as legitimate as any other mode of livelihood. But actually, the goal here really is that it is not regulated as work. if you start thinking about labor law requirements, they cannot be applied in this context. This is actually from one Australian experience specifically, in which the first step was legalization, and they do that, and then they find it's a total failure. And then they say, oh, because it's a total failure, now we must decriminalize across the board. From the sexual exploitation perspective, that is called out of the frying pan into the fire, but from their perspective, it's called, we took a partial step, and it was a failure, so now let's take the whole step, okay? So countries, the Netherlands, Germany, New Zealand, Victoria, and other places in Australia, as well as 10 counties in Nevada, the United States, have adopted variations of this legal approach. Although some are reconsidering, retreating from it, thinking about an alternative. So the sexual exploitation approach seeks ultimately to abolish prostitution. It is an abolitionist position. The best way to end this industry is debated, but full criminalization, as I said, is rejected as being useless, punitive, and irrelevant, and that it does more harm than good, especially to the people used in the industry. Penalizing the buyers, the demand, as well as the sellers, as in pimps and traffickers, but key to the demand, and providing services and job training and anything else that people in prostitution say that they want, is the approach pioneered in Sweden and has been in effect in Sweden for the longest time. It came into effect 1999 in the year 2000. Passed in 1999 and then in effect in 2000. Then Iceland, Norway, and changes elsewhere in the direction of it, say in the UK, that point that way. This is based on the known reality that the demand drives the sex industry. No buyers. If there are no buyers, there will be no sellers, hence no sold people. This asymmetrical law is actually my approach, created with Andrea Dworkin, as mentioned by Tal, and proposed by me in Sweden as an equality measure against violence against women in 1990. And then Swedish women then took it forward entirely themselves and got it passed in 1999, which was the first year they had a majority of women in their parliament. And then has been adopted in all the places that Tal mentioned. There also have been movements in South Africa that are in this direction. There's also now some very interesting litigation in South Africa, which, like South Korea, has expressly criminalized buyers, but not in the Nordic, or what I call the equality model, which I'll explain why it's equality. And there's been a lot of debate in the Scottish Parliament about it, etc. You can find these things all online. So this equality model, as it's termed, here, it's at least as crucial as criminalizing the buyers and enforcing that, and enforcing it, is decriminalizing prostituted people, which sometimes seems even harder to achieve. Actually, what I've found is much of the left tends to oppose criminalizing the buyers. They think it is liberated sex, even dig this, under capitalism. And the right tends to oppose decriminalizing people in prostitution because they are bad, and they made bad choices. So now we're dealing with, the left's morality thing and the right's morality thing. We don't do morality. We do harm, real, actual damage, okay? So the harm approach taken by abolitionists in the equality model, here it is crucial that there is exit support, which is currently, say, effectively provided under the French law. In a growing list of jurisdictions, this initiative, which has shown promise, is increasingly favored by abolitionists as a principled and practical forefront of this movement. The fundamental idea here is to prohibit a human rights violation through the criminal law. People think, here's human rights, here's criminal law. This, in fact, in some ways, like some aspects at the ICC, but it's a much broader concept, is a human rights violation in which the violations are being prohibited through a selective and asymmetrical criminal law. To promote equality by raising the status of prostituted people, by eliminating any criminal status for them, and to lower the status of their exploiters and violators by criminalizing them. In other words, they've started up here, and we're looking for, lowering the status of the people with the power and privilege for a change, and raising the status of the people who have had the lowest, and empowering them legally. Okay? So this is the approach that Israel adopted, the equality model, in 2018. So one more analytic dimension to keep in mind as we go forward in this discussion, and it has 5 parts, but it's quick. Wherever you are in the world, whatever model is adopted or argued for in the debate, and usually in the law, it's organized by these 5 things. These are underlying, actually, moral distinctions in what is seen as like the really, really bad as opposed to the not so really bad, okay? Adult is distinguished from child pornography, indoor from outdoor, legal from illegal, voluntary from forced, and prostitution from trafficking. So when you make these distinctions, child prostitution is always really bad for children. Adult prostitution, not always so bad for adults. Outdoor prostitution can be really rough. Indoor prostitution is seen as less so. I mean, you would think people were exploited by the weather, Illegal prostitution has all these problems that legal prostitution will solve if only we can make it legal. Forced prostitution that's really bad. So-called voluntary prostitution, where you wake up in the morning and go, today's my lucky day, I can go sell myself for, 30 shekels on a street corner, as opposed to, being trained to be a brain surgeon, that kind of thing. Voluntary can be not so bad, at least, right? Trafficking, now that is really, really, really bad. Prostitution, however, if voluntary, indoor, legal, and adult, so we unspin this one, can be a tolerable life for some people. Certain people, groups, mostly women, children, boys, trans people, So measured against the known facts of the sex trade, these purported distinctions emerge as largely illusory. They occupy points of emphasis on a continuum, on continua that converge and overlap. For instance, most adults in prostitution, the majority, entered as children. The current average age worldwide is 14. And they don't lose their vulnerability when they cross some age line. So we've got, whatever yours is, 17 years and 366 days. Suddenly, they're not children anymore. They're choosing adults, So I'm saying it's a bit of a false line that we're given between children and adults, about which much more can be said. Indoor prostitution actually gives the people in it even less control over their situation than when they are outdoor. When they are indoor, they are lined up for selection. The term used on purpose. Legal prostitution, metastasizes the harms of prostitution while escalating illegal prostitution right next to it. So not only does it not solve the problems of illegal prostitution, it exacerbates them, it aggravates them. Depending on the meaning of voluntary, I would just suggest that nobody is free of social forces of inequality that track the people with the least power into prostitution. In other words, if it's such a free act, why are the people with the least freedom found to be the ones doing it the most? Also, under the Palermo Protocol, the definition of trafficking, which has some good language, includes abuse of power and conditions of vulnerability that give rise to sexual exploitation. And combining that with the fact that a good 90% of prostituted people internationally are pimped, most prostitution is, under that definition, actually trafficked. So I'm just demolishing these supposed distinctions. So in light of evidence of prostitution's realities, in other words, these moral distinctions are ideological, although they have real consequences in law, policy, and culture. These distinctions have tended to underlie the whole discussion of prostitution in Israel over time, that I actually have participated in for some decades now. Passing the law has shifted this debate considerably, but all these tensions and tendencies tend to re-arise now in the currently reopened debate over making the law permanent. So now I'm going to say a few things about the Israeli prostitution law, and a lot of you will already know more than this, and feel free to correct anything as needed, but in light of this context, Israel's current law is a version of the equality model, Nordic equality model, which was passed in 2018, came into effect July 2020, now is at the end of its 5-year trial period. It prohibits, at least the translations I've been able to find, quote, the consumption of acts of prostitution, end quote, whoever that is. It provides administrative fines for violators. Its prohibition on consumption of acts of prostitution with a minor provides actually jail time of up to 5 years. The law also, crucially, provides various forms of quite substantial support for people seeking to leave prostitution. And our panel hopefully will be able to describe that in more specific detail. So it was passed to last 5 years, to be studied and considered then for permanent status. On March 17th, 2025, a bill was introduced in the Knesset to make it permanent, together with some improvements in it. Its permanence is supported by the Ministry of Justice, bravo, and by prostitution survivor groups. Yes, our people. The possibility for its permanent status looks actually quite promising, despite the usual debates along some of the lines just mentioned being recycled. So this term, consumption of sex acts, appropriately targets the demand, and I'm not recommending changing the terms. I am a picky person, so at least in English, it comes off fairly euphemistic. That is, it makes it sound as if no human is involved. A woman is not a drug. She is not consumed. She is used, abused, violated, and exploited. Prostitution, to me, is the buying and selling of human beings for sexual use. Prostitution is sex acts coerced by other valuable consideration. So the main purpose of the law, as it states, is to reduce the demand for prostitution, hence prostitution itself, and its damage and harms, which it recognizes, and to support the effort against sex trafficking. The sex industry being correctly understood as the destination and whole point of sex trafficking. People are trafficked for sex in order to be prostituted, all right? People act like these are two wholly different things. The Israeli definition of sex trafficking is actually inspired from 2006. It prohibits kidnapping to put a person in danger of prostitution or of being put in pornography, or of leaving their country for the purpose of being put into prostitution. Trafficking, I am told and was able to find, the term is better translated from the Hebrew in its, you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, as transactions in persons. I like this a lot, okay? Persons who transact persons or place a person in danger of transactions, specifically including subjecting a person to an act of prostitution or participation in a pornographic publication or show. I mean, this is inspired, brilliant, practical, okay, is subject to 16 years imprisonment. The point being, trafficking and prostitution are tightly interconnected here in law, as they actually are in life. So much credit, to this particular structure. The prostitution law of 2018 also had the purpose of educating and informing the public on the realities of prostitution. A series of studies have been done on the impact and effectiveness of the 2018 law, and survivors have reflected on it also and been studied. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've learned from this, just in case any of this, you haven't seen this. So since the law went into effect, of course, we had the COVID pandemic and the war between Israel and Hamas following the atrocious and horrific October 7th attack. And that has all significantly affected both prostitution itself and the enforcement of the law against it, along with much else. The surveys of sex buyers, people in prostitution, and the public conducted during this period by what I'm told is an entity called Myers JDC Brookdale, using survey methodologies of substantial samples and other data sources, found a significant decrease in prostitution following the law's passage and some enforcement over time. A separate study by the same group based on digital Google Trends searches, which actually compared linear regressions from time period before and after the law, which is extremely smart, also showed a strong drop in the frequency of searching prostitution-related terms following its passage. Now, this also connects with the debate over the law in which people say, oh, you prohibit the demand, all you're doing is shoving it underground. Check it out. If the buyers can find the woman, law enforcement can find the buyers. Hello? It's like, and, if it all goes digital, the buyers are not the only people who are able to search digitally, right? So, this particular study also found that searches for prostitution increased as enforcement decreased. This is sort of a dose rate response, like in medicine. From the beginning of 2023, 5,091 sex buyers were fined, which I think per capita is about 5 per 10,000 Israelis, which is kind of like a lot of people, mostly for being in brothels. This is 87%. Being in a situation or position in which you're about to consume a sex act, right? For the purpose of consumption of a sex act. And the rest, 87%, the difference to 100, for actually purchasing a sex act. As I say, whoever she is. After Ben Gvir took charge, well, look, let's get with this here. The 2023 arrests dropped to 866. And in 2024, they dropped to 174. Okay? The arrests that occurred, also, the ones that happened were mostly in 3 areas. They were in Tel Aviv, Rishon LeZion, and Kiryat Haim. Okay, so, wow, Haifa, Jerusalem, Beersheba, Eilat, I mean, just nothing, nada, according to this data. That is, the rest of the country saw largely no enforcement at all under the law. Buyers, once arrested, are given an option for an educational program. We call this diversion in the U.S. Very few took it. 109 took it in the 21-23. That's 109 out of the 5091 number. Also, most of them didn't pay their fines on time. So, some support is actually given for exit, I am told, which is reportedly better than in most places in the world, although it could be improved, and again, I hope the panel will discuss this. Since people enter prostitution due to a combination of poverty and other forms of powerlessness and social marginalization, usually having been previously sexually abused, mainly but not exclusively in childhood, and here we're talking in the 90% numbers, leaving prostitution requires everything prostitution takes away, because other people take away the most of the money, and the trauma of the experience reiterates what happened previously. And then there's often drug addiction and alcohol use to get through the day, all of that. The situation takes away everything that you need to get out of it, making it extremely difficult. So other studies have found that the financial, educational, and employment support, particularly for transgender persons in prostitution, has been insufficient. They noted that specifically in these studies.
Yeah.
Okay, so women in prostitution who I know, hundreds in India and the United States, for instance, all have very clear ideas of the lives they want. And prostitution is not that life. 89% of them offered, they were not asked, this language. They were asked, what do you most need? And this is across countries, across legal statuses, indoor, outdoor, across those distinctions. What do you most need? They say some version of, I most need to leave prostitution, but I don't know how to get out. This is what is termed sexual slavery, when one is in it and can't leave. That is, they are not choosing in any meaningful sense of the term to stay in. They really have few, if any, real options materially or psychologically, which is what makes exit support, including, again, for drug addiction and other debilitating consequences like complex PTSD that often accompany prostitution, such a critical part of this law. So despite some of these shortfalls, strong support for the law was found among prostituted persons here in Israel, approximately 3/4 favoring it, compared with 1/4 not. Support for the law is also strong among the Israeli public overall. 70% say they favored it recently, with more support among Israeli women than men, although only 5% of the entire sample expected it to reduce prostitution in Israel. So this is a view that prostitution is inevitable, along with, I think, the view that rape is inevitable, which many people think, may underlie this. At least that's one possible interpretation. Most buyers asked why they bought people in prostitution said it's the easiest way to have sex, which suggests minimally a sense of entitlement. To editorialize, I will submit to you that nobody is entitled to intimate access to another person because they want to have sex with them. Having sex with someone who wants to have sex with you apparently is not easy. Wow. So further to the Israeli context, given that one purpose of the law is reducing sex trafficking, it's important to observe that sex trafficking in Israel has been observed by the U.S. State Department to involve many, and this is a quote, Israeli children, Israeli Bedouin and Palestinian women and children, foreign women, and transgender adults and children, end of quote, as being particularly vulnerable. They referred to the vulnerability. As to foreign women, and now this is me, not them, from other sources we know of, say, Ukrainian women during the war there, but not exclusively during the war there, and some really solid work here against that and other Eastern European women being imported. Also, there are Asian women, Latin American women. Also used in prostitution in Israel are young men from the West Bank. And there is an apparently large demand for trans women here. So this exploitation of the women, including trans women, children, and some men, of already disadvantaged groups, is not at all unique to Israel. Indeed, it is the common pattern across the globe. Whoever is deprived of equal opportunities, say people of color and indigenous people in the United States and Canada, for example, especially women, are vastly, vastly disproportionately found in prostitution. Also, Israeli women, of course, are pimped in Israel. And women in prison, in unknown numbers, are often groomed and recruited for prostitution while they are in prison, and then used when they come out. That is all this, sexual abuse in childhood in the 90th percentile, economic destitution, racial, ethnic, and gender discrimination, is what it takes to provide this easy way to have sex, right? In which the sex acts are not confined to the conventional acts of sex. In the larger regional picture here, some sex trafficking practices by Hamas during the war in Gaza have been documented. And we have received reports of pressure by international sex traffickers on vulnerable, internally displaced Israeli women and girls, and also on girls in Gaza during the present conflict as well. So clearly, although that last piece is in a completely different enforcement category, stronger enforcement, that is, law enforcement implementation toward changing social norms, and more focus on the multi-factored nature of this abuse is needed and could make a real difference. All efforts toward sex equality, and this was highlighted in Tal's introduction, actually, that create conditions that reduce the vulnerability of people being drawn into this vortex of violation in the first place, in which damage is done to people that challenges them really for the rest of their lives, and in a phrase from the U.S. Supreme Court about racism, may never be undone, is an urgent, urgent priority. So now, the main argument raised here in Israel and in the rest of the world against the equality model is, and also against Israel's current law, is full legalization or across-the-board decriminalization. This is sometimes advanced on labor law and human rights grounds. And there are some distinctions between legalization and full decriminalization, but they really overlap a lot and are roughly interchangeable in many ways. That is, if you remove a criminal sanction for an act that was formerly criminal, you make it legal. So legalization decriminalizes and decriminalization legalizes. Okay, so New Zealand is thought, say, to represent the most fully decriminalized model. Germany, the more legalized and more regulated model. However, a lot of times these details are reversed. For example, Germany permits foreign women to be used in its brothels. New Zealand prohibits it. So there are prohibitions under full decriminalization, and the way so-called regulation works is often entirely incomplete. So legalization generally involves regulations like registration, health checks, official brothels, payments to cities, taxes, giving the government a stake in continuing the prostitution. Okay, that all happens under legalization. I actually think, as I said, that the main purpose of legalization is to show it's a failure in order to pave the way for full decriminalization, so that pimps and traffickers can have open season, that is, hunting and selling sexual use of women, children, and young men. So for your consideration, I'm going to now briefly argue that the consequences of legal prostitution, legalized or decriminalized, satisfy the international legal standard for crimes against humanity. And further, that this happens to the extent that when the constituent crimes are taken together, that legal prostitution should be recognized as a crime against humanity in itself. The full analysis of all this is contained in an article published 2 weeks ago with Max Waldman, who is a Swedish political scientist, in the Harvard Journal of International Law. The evidence from the countries that have legalized or decriminalized, we compare with those that have adopted the Nordic or equality model, including Israel. And this contrast exposes the distinction between these two models in high relief. That is, the two models, the sex work model leading to decriminalization and the sexual exploitation approach leading to the Nordic model, and supports this particular argument. So you compare these Nordic equality model arguments with legalized, decriminalized countries. The largest empirical regularity you see is the massive increase in prostitution itself in legalized countries, sucking more vulnerable people, especially women of marginalized groups, into the sex industry, and with all of its well-documented harms, including in Germany, many, many times over, has increased its prostitution since full legalization, compared with some substantial reduction in places like Sweden, quite dramatic, in the 85% or so, in the numbers of people used in prostitution and actually in trafficking. It is stupid to traffic people into Sweden because you can't sell them. In other words, the whole point of trafficking people they traffic them mostly into legalized countries because women, unlike other things they traffic, drugs, gasoline, mostly, guns, get used up, all right? Women, it takes longer to use them up, so they keep paying and keep paying and keep paying, right? But it's really stupid to traffic them in to countries where their buyers are criminals. Why would you do that? And anyway, some intercepts show that, these people are not stupid. So trafficking also dramatically reduces usually, but it isn't completely gone. So this explosion in prostitution occurs despite the expressed intention, say, of the German parliament to reduce sex trafficking and all of its accompanying criminality. Illegal prostitution explodes with legalization. Vast numbers of foreign women coming like a magnet into legalized locations. In parts of Australia, illegal prostitution especially grows up right next to the legal brothels. So what you have, if you have regulation, all right, this easy way to have sex, they want to have it the way they want to have it. They don't want the government telling them things they can do and not do. So you go into a legalized brothel. They take away your belt, your cigarette lighter, your tie, your shoelaces, Are you getting the picture here? In other words, lethal weapons, okay? So you can't go and do that kind of thing to the women in the legal brothels. They're not paying for that. They're paying to do what they want to do. So they go next door to the single nationality, non-English speaking, Asian typically, women, brothel, top to bottom, pay a little more and do everything they want to be doing. Actually, some places have even decided, since they're being so careful with their legalization, that they shouldn't have sheets or pillowcase or pillows either in these rooms. I mean, think about it. Right? What is a pillow for? What can you do with it that will kill her before she can get to the panic button, of which the high-end brothels have 4, by the way, in case anyone wonders, does anyone know how dangerous this is? On time. Okay. The harms are not controlled under legal prostitution, I am saying. The sexual assaults in the sex trade, that is, the ones that aren't paid for, haven't decreased either in New Zealand or in Germany since their laws were passed, and no one expects them to. No one there. Over 80 women have been murdered in the prostitution setting in Germany since legalization, compared with none, 0, in the sex industry itself in Sweden since they passed the Nordic model. Germany promised no all-day flat rate, anything goes brothels. Exactly this is available and advertised there. State entities are cashing in on this business, otherwise called the pimp's cut, which is what we call it when it isn't official. When just the regular pimp gets it. Only a tiny percentage, it's very telling that only a tiny percentage of people in prostitution actually sign up for the health and pension benefits. The last I saw in Netherlands, this just knocked me right out, was 4%. Germany, it's bigger than that, but still an extremely small percentage of people signing up for these apparent benefits. Talking to the women, they don't want that they were in prostitution to be a part of their official life history. And the stigma remains in legalized countries compared with Sweden, where there is some indication that it is shifting to the buyers. That is, younger people, especially in much larger numbers, are just like, huh? You're like, paying someone to have sex with you? Really?
What?
Who does that? So it's called shift in stigma, right? Basically, legalization legalizes prostitution's harms, okay? Framed in terms of standards for crimes against humanity, prostitution, when legalized or decriminalized, produces widespread, although it only has to be or, systematic attacks on civilians that include sex trafficking, rape, sexual slavery, and enslavement. The Israeli brilliant trafficking law talks about enslavement as involving powers generally exercised toward property. I love this. It's exactly right. In other words, you're reduced to an object and powers are exercised over you that are generally, you're rented, sold to, for use, as if you are a thing. It's called objectification, right? When state actors, which is like a policy is required for this, required by the ICC anyway, not always actually by customary law, but say, and I use the ICC as the most restrictive definition of crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity are nationalized in a lot of different countries, and producing customary law that is, has broader standards, as some of you will be aware. But particularly now, there's no problem knowing that this is a policy, because it's passed as a policy. Other crimes against humanity, there's all this hair tearing. How are we going to show this was a policy, right? Here, you pass the law. It says right here, so no problem. So, and state actors are involved in it when they eliminate sanctions for buyers who can be termed Johns, customers, clients, dates, punters, or my absolute favorite, the not women who I know in Bihar, in India, call them passengers. Okay, so perfect. And the sellers, that is the pimps, the brothel owners, the traffickers, that is the third parties, when this is allowed by the state, what the state is doing is effectively enforcing prostitution by allowing third parties to coerce vulnerable populations, including trans women, girls, boys, young adult men, often racially, ethnically, and religiously targeted people, and subordinated groups. It's called forced prostitution, which is another crime against humanity. So even if pimping and trafficking are still crimes, the legal enforcement apparatus under decriminalization is typically so eroded that nothing effective is done about them. For example, in New Zealand, where not one single case of sex trafficking has been brought for years, despite considerable evidence that it occurs. So when prostitution's crimes are legally exonerated, as they are under legalization and decriminalization, those who instituted the governmental policy are arguably responsible for the crimes against humanity that proliferate as a direct result of their actions. Everybody got this? Okay. In addition, it's like somebody really suddenly the penny dropped. Like, who are we talking about here? Persecution, this is another international crime against humanity, also occurs, and I haven't published on this yet, but hopefully somebody will let us publish this, also occurs with legalization and decriminalization. Persecution, as defined again under the Rome Statute, which is a narrow definition, is in essence, although this is its essence really, a criminal form of discrimination. A widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population that includes the intentional, this is a quote, so intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights contrary to international law by reason of the identity of the group or collectivity. So everything I've been saying about who everyone is who is in this, right? This is who is being targeted for it, I'm saying now legally, are being persecuted. Okay? Such acts must be committed in connection with any act also referred to as a crime against humanity in the Rome Statute, or any crime within the jurisdiction of the court, again to use the most restrictive definition, in pursuit of a state or organizational policy to commit them. And by the way, no nexus with war is required for people who have a historical understanding of the development of the law of persecution. That isn't required anymore. And the identities covered include national, ethnic, cultural, religious, or gender-based reasons for the attack. So gender-based persecution, aggravated by legalization and decriminalization, can be found in connection with the recognized crimes against humanity of enforced prostitution, as I said, sexual slavery, people who can't get out, sex trafficking, the destination of it, and enslavement based on gender and gender intersectionally combined with race, ethnicity, religion, say. It can also be shown to be intimately integral to the crimes against humanity of, these are more, torture, rape, and other gender-based crimes of sexual violence of comparable gravity. So prostitution, I'm saying more when legalized, but there's a lot of learning out there on this. It doesn't matter if it's already, all this is already happening. You then legalize it, you're responsible for what happens after that. Okay, so people are thinking, yeah, she's made this heavy case against prostitution already, but now she's saying it's a crime against humanity when legalized. Okay, what they're saying is you can be discriminating against people, you can be violating their rights endlessly, you can be treating them very badly in your society, all these harms can be happening. You then do it by policy, we're holding you for the whole thing. See? All right, so more, when legalized, has been shown to deprive prostituted people of their fundamental rights, of liberty and equality, as well as life, on the basis of sex, gender, and racial identities, among other grounds, separately and in combination. So, separately and together, these crimes constitute persecution, which is an amazing legal concept. That is, it reaches out from the narrowest group, which here is already a huge group of people, that is, prostituted people, who are defined by gender, which, again, just to talk about the ICC, is defined as sex in social context. I think they thought they were getting away with a lot by doing that, but that failed. Okay, already, okay, everything that is needed, okay, I think. So moves out from prostituted people to all the people subject to being drawn in to the sex industry by legalization, which I'm saying is 2, 3, 4 times as many already. They are being persecuted here. I mean, that's what has to happen. You know, it's one thing to try to do whatever you can do to support people who are already in it. Stop them getting more people in it. You know, it's just like sucking vortex. Anyway, that is persecution according to this. And then, like, particularly of women, other feminized people, and sexualized racial, ethnic, and religious groups with all the human rights violations involved. And then there is an argument to be made about the persecution of women as such, as a total social. What does it do to the status of women to have women be able to be bought for sexual use? What is that? Okay, what is the relation between that and, you know, all women? I mean, that's the persecution argument, and opens up, you know, that discussion. So when decriminalized through state policy, legalized prostitution converges these recognized multiple crimes against humanity into widespread systematic attacks on civilians based on their identities, centrally through sex and gender, to arguably constitute a crime against humanity in itself. So, in case anyone missed the implication here, when all the technical requirements are met, from jurisdiction through evidence to liability, which, by the way, this is going to be 4 articles. This is just the first one that came out. It is state officials, legislators, executive members, potentially, possibly judicial actors, depending what they do, whoever could be found responsible for the state policy, including non-state actors who are very active in this sphere, and its knowing execution, are committing crimes against humanity, for which they could be held criminally accountable under international criminal law. So why international? Because local jurisdictions, that is the usual complementarity approach, local jurisdictions are favored, obviously cannot necessarily be relied on against local laws and policies, because they've just legalized it. Okay, so that's why international, although it isn't impossible, you know, but I'm just saying. And authorities who support and implement the Nordic equality model as Israel's current law, being considered to be made permanent, are doing the opposite of engaging in crimes against humanity. They are reducing those crimes, reducing those harms, hence reducing prostitution and promoting equality. Thank you.